There's plenty of weirdness in the Douglas MacArthur story. This is a 5-star general who vomited on the steps of the White House, and not from a stomach bug, but from pure physical exhaustion after a screaming match with President Franklin D. Roosevelt over military budget cuts. A general who wore the same battered, deliberately crushed hat for decades because he liked the look of it, who meticulously orchestrated his public image to ensure every photograph looked cinematic, and who essentially ran occupied Japan for years like a personal sovereign kingdom, until he got fired by Harry Truman for forgetting who was actually in charge. So yeah, that would be Douglas MacArthur. That's the kind of man we're dealing with. Genius, egomaniac, and one of history's great self-mythologizers. Let's start with the look, because that's where most people's idea of weird MacArthur begins. We all know the corncob pipe that became almost as recognisable as the general himself, the oversized aviator sunglasses decades before aviators were a fashion statement, and that hat so battered and crushed that he refused to swap it out for a new one year after year. This wasn't laziness or bizarreness for its own sake, it was branding, and MacArthur understood something most of his contemporaries didn't. Image is a weapon too, not just a distraction from the real work of war. Take October 1944, when MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte in the Philippines with the cameras rolling, water at his knees, jaw set, sunglasses catching the light. That single photo became one of the most reproduced images of the entire war. But here's the part people actually argue about. Some claim the first wade didn't look dramatic enough for the photographers, so he waded back out and did it again. That detail is contested and might be exaggerated in the retelling, but the instinct behind the story rings true either way, because MacArthur always knew exactly where the camera was pointed. He'd built an entire public mythology around 3 words from 1942. I shall return, and spent 2 years making sure the photograph matched the promise. That's not just eccentric behaviour from a man who liked nice sunglasses. That's a general directing his own legend in real time, in the middle of a world war. Now, let me explain where the weirdness actually grows roots, and it starts long before the pipe or the sunglasses ever existed. MacArthur's father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., was a genuine Civil War hero, a brave officer and a Medal of Honor recipient for his actions at Missionary Ridge as a young lieutenant. Douglas grew up chasing a legend he could never quite catch, no matter how many records he broke of his own. His mother didn't make things easier as well. When Douglas enrolled at West Point, Mary MacArthur moved into a hotel directly across the street, and by most accounts watched his dormitory window every night to make sure the light was still on. Unsurprisingly, the other cadets noticed. He picked up the nickname Mama's Boy, and later, during the war, Dugout Doug, a jab at accusations that he stayed too far from the actual front lines. Put those two ingredients together: a father whose shadow felt impossible to escape, and a mother who never quite let go, even once he was a grown man in military school. And you begin to understand that this combination tends to produce someone who doesn't just want to be a good general, but needs to be the general and the only name anyone remembers. The pipe, the sunglasses, the exaggerated photographs, none of it is really vanity for its own sake. It's a lifetime spent proving something to two people who, by the time he was famous, weren't even around to see it. Now fast forward to 1945. Japan surrenders, and MacArthur is handed one of the strangest jobs in modern history: Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP for short. In practice, that meant he rewrote Japan's constitution, reshaped its economy, and restructured its schools and media almost single-handedly. Some historians describe the authority he held there as close to absolute, and Japanese civilians reportedly bowed as his car passed through the streets. He regularly left his Tokyo headquarters to tour and inspect the country, though Japanese officials and leaders frequently travelled to meet with him as well. This is the same man Dwight Eisenhower once served under as a junior aide. Eisenhower later summed him up simply, saying MacArthur could never stand to share the sky with another son because he needed to be the only light in the room, always. For a few years in post-war Japan, he essentially was. No real opposition party to answer to, no free press pushing back, no rival general sharing the building. And that kind of unchecked power doesn't cure a big ego, it simply waters it. Now let's circle back to that vomiting story from the beginning, because there's more to it. It's 1934, deep in the Depression, and Roosevelt proposes slashing the Army's budget by more than half. MacArthur, then Army Chief of Staff, gets really furious. By his own account, he told the president that when a dying American soldier curses a name on some future battlefield, he didn't want that name to be MacArthur, he instead wanted it to be Roosevelt. That's quite an extraordinary thing to say to a president. Roosevelt snapped back hard enough that MacArthur immediately backed down, apologised, and offered his resignation. Roosevelt waved it away and told him to go work things out with the budget office instead. Then, walking out onto the White House porch, MacArthur was suddenly violently sick. What's worth saying is that this story comes mostly from MacArthur's own memoir, which is convenient since it makes him look both principled and dramatic in the same breath. Still, multiple biographers repeat it independently, so it's at least plausible, even if not airtight history. 16 years later, a version of the same pattern plays out with much higher stakes in Korea, 1950, where MacArthur is commanding UN forces while running the war from a headquarters in Tokyo, not anywhere near the front. Critics argued he'd grown too comfortable being untouchable, too far removed from the men actually fighting. Then he goes further. He publicly pushes for bombing targets inside China and openly disagrees with Truman's strategy in the press, more than once. For a 5-star general, undercutting your commander-in-chief in public isn't just an eccentric quirk, it's a constitutional problem, and MacArthur never seemed to grasp the difference. After years of being scap, years of being the only sun in the sky, he'd apparently started to believe his own judgment simply outranked the president's. But in April of 1951, Truman finally relieves MacArthur of command, and for a 5-star general at the peak of his post-war fame, this was about as close to a public political execution as American politics gets. MacArthur's response was anything but quiet. He returned to the United States and delivered a historic farewell address to a joint session of Congress on April the 19th, 1951, that closed with the words, "Old soldiers never die, they simply fade away." That was one of his most quoted lines in American military history, except he didn't fade away, not even close. He got a ticker-tape parade through New York that drew massive crowds, and he briefly flirted with a run for president the following year, in 1952. That campaign went nowhere fast, which tells you something. The country loved the myth of MacArthur, it just didn't want the actual man running it. That's the MacArthur Paradox in a single month. Fired for insubordination, celebrated like a conquering hero weeks later. So was MacArthur genuinely weird, or was he just supremely uncomfortably confident in a way that made everyone around him uneasy? Here's my honest read. The pipe and the sunglasses are just costume, and anyone can walk into a store and buy sunglasses. The real weirdness sits underneath. A man raised to outshine a war hero father he could never quite match, watched over by a mother who never stopped hovering, then handed, for a few years in occupied Japan, something close to unchecked personal power. Add those 3 ingredients to a world stage, and you don't get a harmless eccentric. You get someone who genuinely can't tell the difference anymore between his own judgment and the national interest. His biographer, William Manchester, titled his book on MacArthur, American Caesar. And that wasn't an accident. Caesar was brilliant too, and just as allergic to taking orders from anyone he considered beneath him. MacArthur helped win a world war. He also very nearly triggered another one, over an argument about who was really in charge. That's not just a weird guy with a funny hat. That's a warning about what happens when raw talent and unchecked ego grow up together for 50 straight years. Alright, please tell me down in the comments, what do you think about this story? And if you want the next one of these, subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.